It's the 2022 World Cup. It's the squad update for Denmark. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin and today we'll be updating Denmark's squad for the 2022 World Cup. The final squads are out, so here is the promised update mediacast where we look at the selections, the non-selections, the surprises and the injury updates that we made in our full team podcast, where we went through all the candidates, gave career and participation information and predicted their likelihood of making the squad. So today we'll check out how accurate our predictions were and we will update the recent games. Check the show notes for links to that full player mediacast, as well as the group mediacast where we took a close look at the teams, and that's where we talked about their history and their prospects in this tournament. But let's get started. If you want the short version, jump to the end where we give a summary of the selections and injuries and reassess our predictions of the starters and of the team's prospects. Okay, well, we should talk a bit about my shirt because it is not a Denmark shirt and I feel tremendous shame about that. But the poverty of shirts that I suffer does give me an opportunity to wear the only shirt I can. All I can do is color match here, and so I have white underneath, and it gives me the opportunity to wear my Canada shirt. So you'll have to put up with a little a little Canada bias there. But I'm hoping in the future I will have a Denmark shirt to wear when I podcast on Denmark. All right, let's begin with a look at the formations. And we are focused on the games in September because we didn't cover that in our previous podcast. But we will kind of overview the formations that they have been using. So in the Euro Cup, they started with a 4-3-3. But they went quickly to a 3-4-2-1 formation. That largely might have been because of the terrible heart attack that Christian Eriksen had on the field. We do kind of feel that this has influenced their lineup decision. Anyway, after the Euro Cup, they went into World Cup qualifying with different formations. So sometimes 5 at the back and sometimes 4 and sometimes 3. If it was 5 at the back, that would mean a 3-man central defense. And they kind of switched back and forth from 3 and 4 for the whole time. So in the World Cup, we have a 5-4-1 and a 4-1-4-1. And then twice they went with a 3-2-2-2-1 there. So not a lot of pattern to it, I must say. Again, 2 different formations in the friendlies. And in the Nations League games in June and in September, again, different formations being used. But they did prefer a 3-man backline for 4 of those games and a 4-man backline for the other 2. So yeah, we're not seeing a lot of pattern to it, and it's kind of hard to predict what they're going to come into the cup with. Christian Eriksen came back, and he was out for 9 months. And yeah, actually, it doesn't seem like they used a formation rotating around the central attacking midfielder. We're going to see that Eriksen was kind of all over the field upon his return. So anyway, the key point is that in games 5 and 6, they went with a 5-4-1 formation. That was a formation that they had only used once before in the first game of World Cup qualifying. And then with a 4-3-3 formation, a formation they had only used twice before. So kind of further confusing the issue there. Generally, they had favored something like a 3-4-1-2 something along that lines, or a 3-4-2-1. So we're not really sure what they're going to come into the cup with. But I will say that, I'll tell you how those games went. The first September friendly was, sorry, not a friendly, it was a Nations League game away to Croatia. That was a 1-2 loss. And the last one was against France, who they meet in the group stage here. That was a 1-0 win. So I think they beat France both games in Nations League. That left them in second place in the Nations League group, behind group winners Croatia, but they did finish ahead of France and Austria. In terms of players, it seems like a few decisions were being finalized in those September games as far as who their starting lineup was. With potential starters being used in those games and no real experimental players coming in from the outside. It was more like a few players returning to positions that they had experimented with, especially in March. And those experiments had been forced by injuries to a degree. So the general trend was that they seemed to return to their tried and true players, having tried out a few players probably in the last couple of games of World Cup qualifying, because they had already secured advancement, and in the March friendlies. Okay, well, we'll take a look at those players, the squad. So let's begin with the manager. So Kasper Hjulmand. Kasper Hjulmand took over Denmark in 2020, so he will lead them through the cup. So we're going to call him a selected player. He has been selected for the World Cup. Okay, so with the positions here, for example, goalkeeper, we're going to begin by naming all of the candidates, and then we'll go through again and say which ones were selected for the squad, and we'll finish each section with a summary of the position we've just talked about. So for goalkeepers, we had a definite candidate, Kasper Schmeichel. And yes, in the main player podcast, we justified why we put them into these categories, so we won't repeat all that here. So Kasper Schmeichel, we have possible candidates Frederik Ronau and Peter Vindal Jensen. And we also had a possible but unlikely candidate, Jesper Hansen. And finally, two players who seem to be off the squad but had played within the last couple of years. That is Jonas Lossell and Daniel Iverson. And by played, I don't necessarily mean took the field, but were called up and were at least on the bench. Okay, well, let's look at who made it there. In fact, we're going to start just by clearing out candidates who didn't make it. So Jonas Lossell and Daniel Iverson are not part of the squad. And Jesper Hansen, the possible but unlikely candidate, also not selected. Let's go back to the top, and no surprise that Kasper Schmeichel was selected for the squad. Frederik Ronau was selected, but we do have a note on him. And Peter Vindal Jensen was not selected, the possible candidate. Rather, a new candidate was brought in, and that was Oliver Christensen. Kind of surprisingly selected there. I'll tell you a little bit about him because he wasn't on our radar for the full-length podcast there, which we did after the June 2022 games, by the way. So Oliver Christensen, having played his first cap in November 2020, returned after an almost 2-year absence in 2022. And he didn't start either of those remaining 2 games in September, but he was on the bench for both matches and was selected. So he's been on the squad since 2020 with 1 cap, and he is 23 years old and plays for Hertha Berlin in Germany. So somewhat surprisingly called in at the last moment. So those are our 3 candidates. Kasper Schmeichel, Frederik Ronau, and Oliver Christensen. And we'll summarize the position. It's pretty easy to summarize the goalkeeper situation for Denmark. It's always Schmeichel. So that's all there is to say about that. That continued into the September Nations League games. So Kasper Schmeichel, the perennial starter for Denmark. So let's move on to defenders here. And we are starting with central defenders. The candidates are Andreas Christensen, who we put as a definite candidate, Joachim Andersen as a likely candidate, along with Yannick Vestergaard, and possible candidates Simon Kjær and Victor Nelson and Andreas Maxo. We have possible, but no, we don't have any possible but unlikely. But we have one player who seemed to be off the squad, and that's Matthias Jorgensen, sometimes called Zanke Jorgensen. Okay, and we'll remove Zanke Jorgensen because he was not selected for the squad, and some of the possible were, so we'll come back to that. But let's go to the top, and Andreas Christensen was selected. Joachim Andersen was selected. However, surprisingly, Yannick Vestergaard was not selected. And he was among the 5 players who had to wait 6 days for a decision to be made regarding their selection. So the manager first published 21 names and said he would publish the next 5 later down the road. So 6 days later, he did publish the names, and Vestergaard was not among them. And ultimately, he was not selected because he had made no starts for his club, Leicester, in the new season. So that was the reason given for that. Simon Kjær was selected, and I have a note on him. I just realized I forgot to give the note for the goalkeeper above, so I have to go back and do that. Simon Kjær was actually injured. Yes, when we talked about him in the previous podcast, injured, and then he was absent following recovery from his injury. So that's what made us put him down to likely. It's hard to imagine that they wouldn't choose him, but he actually hadn't played that much since the Euro Cup in 2021 because of this injury. So he wasn't actually playing for his club either. But now he is back and captain of the team. We didn't really think he would be left off, but it did kind of come down to injury there. But he was selected. And finally, Victor Nelson, the other possible candidate, was selected. You can see that as kind of taking Yannick Vestergaard's position. But Andreas Maxo was not selected. So that leaves us with Andreas Christensen, Joachim Andersen, Simon Kjær, and Victor Nelson, just 4 centre-backs that they're taking to the Cup. And we'll summarize the position. We spent a lot of oxygen on who among the 4 candidates, that's Andreas Christensen, Joachim Andersen, Yannick Vestergaard, and Simon Kjær, who among them would start. As we said, Kjær had been out for the March and June games, so we kind of wondered if he would return, and if so, would he return to the starting lineup? We kind of speculated that he would return and be part of the starting lineup. Now, with him back and Vestergaard not selected, it seems pretty obvious that all 3 of them will be used if they make a 3-man backline. 2, though, is a bit tougher to predict. And the first September game did have a 2-man central defence, and it was Christian and Andersen pairing up there with Kjær on the bench. I think he did sub in to the game, but he wasn't the starter. However, we do know Kjær is the captain of the team and the morale leader, so we were a bit surprised to see him benched, and I'm still not convinced that he wouldn't be part of a 2-man central defence. Nevertheless, from the objective information we have here, he does seem to be the 3rd choice. Anyway, we think we'll see him on the field, but we'll talk about that at the end when we predict starters. Okay, I just have to pop back and give the note that I was supposed to give, and that was on Frederick Rono. So actually, Frederick Rono, the goalkeeper, picked up a hamstring injury in early November. So he was listed as injured with an unknown return date, but was nevertheless selected, and I believe selected with knowledge of this injury. So perhaps, although a hamstring injury is usually pretty serious, perhaps it's not so serious. Otherwise, they would have left him off the squad or else replaced him by now. So still a chance that he might be replaced if he proves unable to play. But we'll have to see if that's the case. All right, let's move on to left backs. And here we have a definite candidate, Joachim Mail. And we have possible candidate Nicole Bolison, and possible candidate Mads Valentin Pedersen. Sometimes he's called Mads Valentin and sometimes Mads Pedersen. So I just put both names there. Okay, and in terms of the successful candidates here, Joachim Mail did make the squad. However, Nikolai Boyleson did not. He picked up a knee injury in late October, and he's out for the season. The return date is July 2023, poor fellow. It's hard to say if he would have been selected, though, because we had him only as a possible candidate. So either way, though, the injury kind of assured that he was not going to be selected. So we say goodbye to Nicole Boyleson and also Mads Valentin Pedersen, who also didn't make the squad. So that leaves us with just one left back there, Joachim Mail. So I think that's going to make it pretty easy to decide the starter, but we'll talk about the position. When it's a three-man central defense, the position basically becomes a left winger. And either way, Mile has a firm grip on the position and was also a starter in both of the September Nations League games. We do see right back Len Stryger Larson as the backup here. He's played in that role, which was perhaps a hint that Nikolai Boyleson was not kind of favoured as the backup and, would not have been selected for the squad if Stryger Larson really is the backup for that position. Okay, let's move over to right backs, and we have definite candidate Rasmus Christensen and likely candidate Daniel Wass and Jens Stryger Larson. And we have possible candidate Alexander Bahr and a player who seems to be off the squad, Henrik Dalsgaard. So we can reduce the list here quickly. Dalsgaard was the right back in the 2018 World Cup, but is now off the squad. And otherwise, all four of them made it. So Rasmus Christensen, the two likely candidates, Daniel Wass and Jens Stryger Larson, and possible candidate Alexander Bahr, who we gave little chance because there's so many candidates over on this side. So kind of interestingly, one left back brought to the cup and four right backs. But as we said, Jens Stryger Larson can play as a left back or has played as a left back. Okay, in summary of the position, when it's a three-man central defense, as we said on the left side, it's the right defender who moves up. So there was some rotation on this side, but Wass was the one that was most used. We had Rasmus Christensen as a definite based on the fact that he was called up a lot, but actually he wasn't the primary starter. Daniel Wass was, and Daniel Wass played the first September Nations League game, but Rasmus Christensen did play the second. So we'll talk about that when we try to decide a starter among these four right backs. Meanwhile, we move on to the midfield and begin with defensive midfielders, where we have a possible candidate Christian Norgard and also Morten Hjulmand. And possible but unlikely candidate Jens Jonsson. So Jens Jonsson did not make the squad, so we'll remove him from the list here. Also, Morten Hjulmand not making the squad, leaving only Christian Norgard, who was selected for the final squad there. And we won't summarize the position until we go through central midfielders, because the two positions often overlap. So let's look at central midfielders, where we have two definite candidates, Thomas Delaney and Pierre-Emil Højbjerg. We have likely candidate Matthias Jensen, possible candidate Philip Billing, possible but unlikely candidate Kasper Nielsen, and two players who seem to be off the squad, Anders Christiansen and Jens Stage. I'm still not sure how to say the name, but I'm a little frightened of that name. So, but that's not the reason Stage wasn't selected. My being frightened of his name had no role in his non-selection. And but he and Anders Christiansen are not on the squad. Possible but unlikely candidate Kasper Nielsen, also not on the squad. Nor is possible candidate Philip Billing. So that leaves us with the three candidates at the top, Thomas Delaney and Pierre-Emil Højbjerg, both of them making the squad, as well as likely candidate Matthias Jensen making the squad. So woohoo, we did well in our predictions there. Okay, now we can summarize the position. So usually it's a two-man central defense, but sometimes one. And Højbjerg and Delaney, for the most part, started the games since the 2021 Euro Cup, but there were some changes near the end. I won't go through those changes, but it was Højbjerg and Delaney in the September Nations League games, and sometimes there were five across the middle, so in a sense three central defenders, and surprisingly for me at least, Christian Eriksen joined them as a third. And he had done that once before, so I shouldn't be surprised. But usually I think of him as more attacking. He probably was more attacking than a regular central midfielder anyway. Okay, so there we have it. And we'll come back later to talk about who we think are going to be the starters. But that's business for later. The position of left midfielder would be basically when they have a 4-3-3 formation, or I guess five across the middle. You could imagine a central and a left and right central midfielder. But the position was rarely called for. I think we said they used a 4-3-3 three times. However, they did use it in the last September Nations League game, and that's when we saw Christian Eriksen. He played in the centre with Højbjerg on the left and Delaney on the right. But in terms of candidates, the only one we have that's coded as a left or right midfielder is Lasse Schöne, and he last appeared for the team in March 2021, so we have considered him off the squad, and indeed he is off the squad. Not selected for the tournament. So no players coded as left and right midfielders, and if they need that, it's the central midfielders who cover it. Let's move on to left and right wingers, and also there are no candidates here. However, wingers are common in some of the formations they use, like the 4-2-3-1 or the 3-2-2-2-1. And as we saw, or as we said before, it's usually the left and right backs, the left back and the right back, pushing up to that midfield position. So the players we're going to look at who are designated as wingers are really more like attacking midfielders. And I said we had no candidates here, but we do. Have players who are coded as left wingers, but we're going to move them to different positions to discuss them. as I said, because they play more as attacking midfielders or even outside forwards. Anyway, let us. No candidates there. We've moved them. Let's go to left attacking midfielders and left forwards. And actually, here is where we find the players coded as left and right wingers. So we have definite candidate Mikkel Damsgaard and definite candidate Yusuf Poulsen, who is coded as a left winger but often plays on the right. And we also have possible candidates Jacob Brun-Larsen and Mohamed Daramy. Those two did not make the squad, Jacob Brun-Larsen and Mohamed Daramy, so we removed them from the list. We have Mikkel Damsgaard and Yusuf Poulsen. So I'll summarize the position of left attacking midfielder / left forward. And usually it is Mikkel Damsgaard since the 2021 Euro Cup. A few others were used when he was not there, but no one consistently enough to look like they were challenging for the position. So Damsgaard played left forward in the second of the September Nations League game, the position not having been used in the first. Okay, and then we'll come back and look at the possibility of those two players being starters. But meanwhile, we'll move over to the right side and talk about right attacking midfielders and right forwards. And here too, these players are coded as right wingers. So we have Andreas Skov Olsen as a definite candidate, Robert Skov as a possible candidate. We have a note on him, and Anders Drea as seemingly off the squad, and indeed he is off the squad, so we will remove Anders Drea from the list, leaving us with Andreas Skov Olsen, who was selected for the squad, and Robert Skov also selected, but we have a note. So he suffered a hamstring injury the week before the September internationals and was unavailable to play. So it looked like, that's a long-term injury which could last into the World Cup. However, he recovered with amazing speed and was playing for his club in early October. So he actually only missed 1 week of club matches there on September 18th. So Robert Skov back in action. So let's summarize the position. Skov Olsen increasingly moved into the position during the period that we talked about from the Euro 2021 to June 2022. And he played it twice in the September Nations League games, once actually as a winger in that formation that required a winger. So Skov Olsen making the position his own. Okay, let's move on to forwards, and we begin with attacking midfielders. So we have definite candidate Christian Eriksen, and then possible candidate Jesper Lindstrom, and possible but unlikely candidate Pione Sisto. Pione Sisto did not make the squad, so we'll eliminate him. But both Christian Eriksen and Jesper Lindstrom were selected. So we'll summarize the position. Actually, the central attacking midfielder position was not used as much during Eriksen's absence. Actually, it wasn't used much at all, to be honest. When there were two attacking midfielders, like in a 4-3-2-1, for example, it tended to be the outside right attacking midfielder and left attacking midfielder who were playing the role. So when the position was used, though, he was the one who generally played in it. Otherwise, Christian Eriksen took positions kind of in various places on the field. We saw him as a central midfielder earlier. Okay, well, let's finish then with forwards. And we have quite a few candidates here. Definite candidate Andreas Cornelius, likely candidates Martin Braithwaite and Jonas Wind, and possible candidate Kasper Dolberg, and then three players who seem to be off the squad. Marcus Ingvardsson, Mikael Ure, and Nikolai Jorgensen. And none of those three candidates made it, so we will remove them from the list. Nikolai Jorgensen basically retired from the squad, but he was the starter in the 2018 World Cup. But younger players have taken over, and Andreas Cornelius is selected for the squad. And Martin Braithwaite is also selected, and Jonas Wind. Actually, all four of them are here. Kasper Dolberg. We also might add, I probably should have moved Yusuf Poulsen to this position because he has primarily played as a forward in the games he's started, but we'll talk about it when we get to the selection of starters at the end of the podcast. For the time being, we'll summarize the position by saying that they seem to struggle to find a productive enough centre forward. So they rotated through all of these players, including out of position Poulsen there. So Braithwaite really doesn't score very much. We thought Dolberg was good in the Euro Cup, so we were a bit surprised that he wasn't used much after. And after kind of rotating through several players and giving them a try, they returned to the tried and true Martin Braithwaite and Dolberg in the September Nations League games. So back to kind of the traditional players there. Okay, well that ends the player by player review, and so we'll move on to talk about some statistics. We had done statistics on a wider range of players in the previous podcast. Now we can reduce those statistics to just these 23 players. So the average age among these players is, yikes, 27.2 years old. So initially we were saying that 27 was kind of on the older end of the scale, but we're finding that in this World Cup, it really isn't. It's pretty much average. So nothing really to talk about there. 27.0 is the average, so slightly older. They have three players who are 33 years or older, and they have three players who are 22. I would say 22 or younger, but they're all 22. Let's take a quick look at that. So Kasper Schmeichel is the goalkeeper, who is 36 years old, and Simon Kjær and Daniel Wass, both 33. And now there are five players who are 30 or 31, so that makes it 8 players who are 30 or above. But again, 30 and 31 is not too old. So at the lower end of the scale, we have Skov Olsen, is that? Skov Olsen, who is 22 years old, and he's a starter, as is Michael Damsgaard. So the two outside forwards or attacking midfielders, both pretty much starters and both 22 years old. Anyway, fairly average profile of ages there. So we'll move on to caps. The average number of caps among these 26 players, 38.6. 38.6 is a bit higher than the average of other teams. So amongst all teams, 34.2 is the average, and that doesn't surprise me. Denmark seems like a fairly experienced and tight squad who have played a lot together. And so, you know, it is these players who tend to be selected for most of their games rather than experimenting with a whole bunch of different players. Okay, so that is slightly, that is not that far above average, but I think it does indicate the tightness of the squad. We can take a closer look, actually. Simon Kjær has the most caps with 121. And just after him, we have Christian Eriksen with 117. I might have thought Kasper Schmeichel had the most caps, but he's quite a bit behind with 86. And yeah, from there, only 5 players who have 10 caps or less, and they tend to be bench players, no surprise. Yeah, okay, well, we don't want to spend too much time on this, so let's move on to goals, which actually is a concern for Denmark with their forwards. Their continued search to find a forward who will put the ball in the net. Actually, Nikolai Jorgensen, who we saw as the starter in 2018 World Cup, was part of the problem there, and he actually was lost his position after 2 games. They just can't seem to find a forward who will score. Nevertheless, they have a total of 138 goals. So, and that works out to a goals per cap of 13.7. So when we compare this with other teams, we find they're actually more of a scoring team than average. 119 goals is the average. They have 138 amongst their players, and the total goals per cap is 13.7 for Denmark, and the average is 13.5. So let's dig into that situation a bit more, because it seems a bit contradictory. And we see actually immediately we see that it is actually the attacking midfielders getting most of their goals rather than the forwards. So Christian Eriksen with the 39 goals in 117 games, a good ratio of 33.3%. So 1 goal every 3 games, which is good for an attacking midfielder. Not, it's okay for a forward. But none of the forwards are really close to that. Skov Olsen also getting the around the same. He's also an attacking midfielder. Actually, I was wrong. Jonas Wind, the forward, does have the same scoring ratio as Erik Christensen, but only has 15 games, so 5 goals in 15 games. So we don't consider it really until there's more than 20 games. But what we do see here, yes, the forwards. Martin Braithwaite, I said he doesn't score much. 16% is pretty poor for a centre forward. And Josip Poulsen is actually not much higher, 11 goals in 68 games. So we can see why these forwards aren't working out. Andreas Cornelius at 22%, and Kasper Dolberg at 30%, which is not bad. And again, we were surprised that Kasper Dolberg wasn't used, because he did well in the cup. Looks by these statistics like he's one of their top scoring centre forwards. So we wonder why he was kind of taken off the job. Anyway, but what explains how they have a pretty a higher than average goal ratio is that players outside the forwards are scoring quite a bit, especially the attacking midfielders. So Mikael Damsgaard has only 18 games with a 22% ratio there, and yeah, they're getting goals from all over the field. Actually, one of the most surprising ones is the right or left back Joachim Mail with a 29% scoring ratio. So they are getting their goals from somewhere, just not from their centre forwards. All right, let's move on to some summaries then. So we'll begin with notable non-selections. And here we have Yannick Vestergaard, which took us by surprise. But when we looked into it, we realized that it was because he hadn't been starting for his club. So Yannick Vestergaard not selected for the squad. That was really the only surprise there. We also look at surprise inclusions, but we don't really have anyone. Oh no, hang on. Yes, we don't really have anyone except the new candidate, which I'm going to introduce right away here. So not many surprises on Denmark. And that is consistent with kind of their vibe, that they are more of a tight team that sticks with the same players. However, we do have a new player in goalkeeper Oliver Christensen. So that's the only player that was added to the squad late. And then the last section deals with injury concerns. So we have 4 categories. The first one, players recovered from injury. So we'll just name the names because we talked about it above. But Simon Kerr, the captain, was a concern, but he recovered from his injuries and was back playing. Robert Skov, a hamstring injury that turned out to be very brief at the end of September there. Yusuf Poulsen, I don't think I talked about this, so I'll say it here. He had been out with a torn muscle fiber, an injury that continued until September, but he did return in mid-September and was available for those Nations League games at the end of September. So a short injury concern there, and I think we had mentioned it in the previous podcast, so updating it here. And I should also do the same with Jonas Wind because we didn't talk about it when we did the positions above. So he had been out of the September games with a hamstring injury, which he had come into the new season carrying. So in August or September, he already had it. He was recovered by early October. But just as he was returning to starting form for his club, he picked up a muscle injury and quite worryingly missed the last club game before the break on November 12th. However, he's not on the injured list, and he was selected for the squad, although it may be actually this injury occurred after the squad was selected. But I haven't heard anything about him being replaced. So hopefully it's a small problem that they think he will overcome there. But we will include him in the next section because of that recent injury that he picked up. So Jonas Wind recovered from the hamstring injury only to pick up a muscle injury. And that brings us to injury doubts. So we have Frederick Ronau. He had a hamstring injury picked up in early November, and he is listed as injured with an unknown return date, but he was selected with this knowledge, so he remains on the squad. So perhaps it's not so serious because they did know about it. Jonas Wind might be a different case because he seemed to pick up this muscle problem after the squad was selected, or the squad was announced. So, but he is not on the injured list. So, and there's no talk of him being replaced. So, hopefully, too, that's a small problem that he can overcome. So we go to players who have been dropped due to injury, and here we only have Nikolai Boylsson. Yes, well, we could put him in this category or in injured but was not a strong candidate because I suspect they saw Jens Stryger Larsen as the backup in left defense rather than Boylsson. But anyway, it's a knee injury that he picked up in late October, so hard to say if he would have been selected or not. We'll leave him in the category of dropped due to injury, but it could be that he was not really a candidate for selection. Okay, well, let's move on to our predicted starters now and see if anything has changed since we did this in the Full Player podcast after the June games. So for the manager, sorry, I should get rid of the previous manager from our list. Kasper Hjulmand, we'll regard him as a starter, the manager. So Kasper Hjulmand will lead them through the cup. Goalkeepers, we have candidates Kasper Schmeichel, Frederick Ronau, and Oliver Christensen. And we had called Schmeichel to be the starter when we did the full-length podcast. And the smallest shaving off an atom wouldn't even make up the amount of doubt that we have that Kasper Schmeichel will be the starter. So Kasper Schmeichel, our pick for starter. Okay, central defender. We have Andreas Christensen, Joachim Andersen, Simon Kjær, and Victor Nelson. So we have Christensen and Andersen as the starters for sure. And then if it's a two-man backline, but Kjær is the captain and a moral leader, and we'd be a bit surprised to see him benched. But however, he does seem to be the third choice here, and since they often do use a three-man backline, he may well start there. But we're going to say in the case that they use a two-man backline, that he's the third one. He would be on the bench. So we're going to put him as a possible or sometimes starter. But we may be wrong there, and he may be a starter in a two-man backline. We see, but this is a square on the board where we're putting our chips. Okay, left back, little doubt about that. Joachim Mal is the only candidate, and he has been in the position, since the Euro 2021, has a firm grip on the position. And we see right back Len Stryger Larsen as the backup for this position. For right backs, we have four candidates. Rasmus Christensen, Daniel Wass, Jens Stryger Larsen, and Alexander Baa. And we had predicted Wass to be the starter, but we think Rasmus Christensen has an almost equal bid. But we're going to stick with Wass as the starter, though with far less confidence than we have for Mail on the left side. So again, a bit of a gamble there, because Rasmus Christensen could also be the starter. Defensive and central midfielders. We had nominated Højbjerg and Delaney as the starters in the previous podcast, and the September games kind of confirmed that for us. So we once again go with Højbjerg and Delaney starting in the central midfielders. For left attacking midfielders and left forward, it does depend on the formation, but we think of Damsgaard on the left attacking side. Yeah, we had a little bit of doubt because he actually only starts about half the time. That's because sometimes the position is not really used, but I'm going to nominate Damsgaard as a starter here. Yusuf Poulsen is also in this category, categorized as a left winger, but he has played more as a forward. But nevertheless, we do think of Yusuf Poulsen as a starter, whether it's as a forward or in a different position. Could be right or left attacking midfielder. Okay, on the right side, it's more clear. Andreas Skov Olsen has really made the position his own there, so we consider him a starter. And on the attacking midfielders, we have Christian Eriksen, although it's not necessarily as an attacking midfielder. They definitely find room for him, and who wouldn't, because he's a very good player. So we've seen him playing during this period central midfield and as a left winger also. And we've also seen them kind of change the formation so that there is an attacking midfielder role for him. Anyway, we think he will play. He will be a starter. Okay, among the forwards, we've talked about the kind of ongoing search for a scoring centre forward. So in the previous podcast, we didn't nominate any as a starter because they seem to kind of jump from player to player, hoping someone will produce enough goals. So the spot is really there for someone to seize the spot. In the September games, they returned to Braithwaite. To me, that seems an admission of defeat. The guy has a very poor scoring ratio for a forward. We actually preferred Dolberg. He was good in the Euro Cup, and then they used him in the last September game where he scored a goal. The only problem is that we're not the manager, so we're not the one who makes the selection. But we do think he's the best bet. But because they haven't kind of gone with him as the consistent centre forward, we'll just have to choose him in yellow as a possible starter. And really, we could highlight them all in yellow because we may see some rotation in the position. I suppose Braithwaite is kind of second in line there, or maybe even first in line, because they seem to go back to him despite his not really scoring goals for them. Okay, well, that is it, the predictions, and we have closing thoughts. And rather than reviewing the entire conversation that we had in the team podcast about their prospects, we focus on this question. Does the selection change our opinion about their chances? So the answer here is no. There's not significant change on the squad compared to when we talked about them before. And neither for the better nor for the worse. They don't have a lot of injuries. They don't have a lot of change on the squad. So we give them the same chances that they had before. And those chances were basically, we saw them passing the group stage here and, maybe not going as far as they did in the Euro Cup, but, maybe past the round of 16 there. But we do think that quarterfinals would probably be their limit. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this podcast. Keep in mind, we may be editing a list to get a list of the bios of the 26 final candidates. That depends on time, which is not going well because time is getting short before the cup here. If we do produce that, it'll be edits from the main player podcast rather than a separate podcast in itself. Okay. Keep an eye on us, meanwhile, at Soccerphiles Canada. Oh, that always reminds me to put up the page, which I always forget to do, the closing graphic page there for the YouTube watchers. Soccerphiles Canada, that Soccerphiles with a PH in the middle and an S at the end. And our website, soccerphiles.captivate.fm. All of this information is in the show notes, so you can kind of navigate from there. And thanks so much for listening, and we will see you for the next one. Bye-bye.